A dying uncle's so-called joke. Inheritance left everyone laughing, except the struggling janitor who took it seriously. What he found in the basement would change his life forever. Before we dive into this unbelievable story, make sure to subscribe, hit that like button, and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss what happens next. The joke no one understood. The lawyer's office smelled like old paper and expensive cologne. Mason Reeves shifted in his seat, the cheap fabric of his janitorial uniform scratching against a leather chair. Around him, his relatives whisper behind their hands, their eyes flicking toward him with a mix of pity and amusement. He kept his gaze fixed on the floor, his work-roughened fingers gripping his knees. At the front of the room, attorney Carl Whitmore adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat. Now, we'll proceed with the reading of Walter Brannigan's last will and testament. A few stifled laughs broke out. Walter had always been a family joke. The eccentric uncle who lived in that crumbling Victorian on the edge of town, the one who hoarded newspapers and muttered about government conspiracies. Nobody took him seriously, least of all now, when he was finally gone. Mason hadn't even known his uncle was sick. The call had come 3 days ago, some distant cousin informing him, as an afterthought, that Walter had passed and there would be a will reading. He hadn't expected an inheritance. He hadn't expected anything. Whitmore began listing off bequests in a dry, monotone voice. To my niece, Diane, I leave my collection of vintage ashtrays. Diane, perched on the edge of her seat in a designer dress, wrinkled her nose. Great, a bunch of dusty old junk. To my nephew, Greg, I leave my pocket watch. Greg snorted, holding up the tarnished timepiece. Doesn't even work. The room tittered with laughter. Mason kept his head down. Then Whitmore paused, flipping to the next page. His eyebrows lifted slightly. And to my nephew, Mason Reeves. Mason tensed. I leave my house on 214 Elmwood Drive and everything inside it. Silence. Then, like a dam breaking, the room erupted. Diane let out a sharp laugh. Oh, that's perfect. The janitor gets the junk house. Greg clapped Mason on the back. Too hard. Better you than me, man. Place is probably full of rats. Mason didn't react. His mind was spinning. A house. An actual house. He'd spent the last 20 years living in a one-room apartment above a laundromat, scraping together rent on a janitor's salary. And now, this... Whitmore cleared his throat again, raising his voice over the noise. There's a note attached. He adjusted his glasses. It says, to my nephew, the only one who never asked me for a dime, I leave you everything. Good luck. The laughter died down, replaced by murmurs. Mason felt eyes on him, some curious, some suddenly calculating. Diane leaned forward, her voice sharp. Wait, everything inside it? What does that mean? Whitmore shrugged. Exactly what it says. The property and its contents. Greg's smile faded. You're telling me there could be something valuable in that dump? Mason finally looked up, meeting their stares. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to, because for the first time in his life, he had something they wanted, the House of Secrets. The Victorian loomed before Mason like a forgotten ghost. Its once grand facade had surrendered to time. Peeling paint, sagging gutters, and a porch that groaned under his weight as he climbed the steps. The key Walter's lawyer had given him felt cold in his palm, its teeth worn smooth from years of disuse. Mason hesitated. Behind him, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the overgrown lawn. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked, the sound sharp in the quiet neighborhood. He could still hear his cousin's mocking laughter ringing in his ears. The janitor gets the junk house. With a slow exhale, he turned the key. The door stuck at first, swollen from years of humidity, but a firm shove sent it scraping inward. A stale, musty breath of air rushed out to greet him. The scent of old wood, yellowed paper, and something else, something faintly metallic. Mason flicked on his flashlight. The beam cut through the dim interior, revealing a living room frozen in time. Newspapers were stacked in precarious towers, some reaching nearly to the water-stained ceiling. Furniture sat draped in yellowed sheets, their shapes vague and spectral in the half-light. He stepped inside, the floorboards protesting beneath his boots. This is mine now. The thought didn't feel real. A thick layer of dust coated every surface, swirling in the flashlight's beam as he moved deeper into the house. The kitchen was worse. Cupboards hung open, their contents spilling out in a chaotic mess of canned goods, most expired decades ago. Chipped dishes and a single, pristine whiskey glass sitting alone on the counter, as if waiting for its owner to return. Mason ran a finger along its rim. Clean. Odd. A noise from above made him freeze. A creak. Then another. Footsteps. His pulse spiked. The lawyer had said the house was empty. "Hello?" he called, his voice too loud in the silence. No answer. Another creak, this time closer. Mason's grip tightened on the flashlight. He wasn't imagining it. Someone or something was upstairs. Slowly, he backed toward the front door, his eyes locked on the shadowed staircase. The steps groaned again, louder now, deliberate. Then silence. He waited, barely breathing. Nothing. Maybe the house was just settling. Maybe it was rats. But when he turned to leave, something caught his eye, a glint of metal beneath the kitchen table. He crouched, brushing aside a layer of dust. A small, rusted key lay on the floor, its teeth still sharp. And beside it, scratched into the hardwood in what looked like charcoal, were two words. "Look down." Mason's breath hitched. His gaze dropped to the floorboards beneath him. One plank sat slightly higher than the others, its edges worn smooth, as if it had been lifted many times before. He pried it up with his fingers. The space beneath was shallow, barely more than a hand's width, but inside sat a single grease-stained envelope. His name was written across the front in Walter's spidery handwriting. Mason tore it open. A single sheet of paper, folded twice. He smoothed it out, the paper crackling softly in his trembling hands. "Mason, if you're reading this, you're the first person in this house who's actually looked. That means you might be the only one I can trust. Don't let them tell you I was crazy. Don't let them take what's yours. The basement holds the truth. But be careful. Some secrets aren't meant to stay buried. W." A chill crawled up Mason's spine. The basement. He hadn't even noticed the basement. But as he stood, the flashlight's beam swept across the far wall of the kitchen, and there, half hidden behind a stack of mildewed boxes, was a door. Old, heavy, and padlocked shut. The hidden threat. The padlock was cold and heavy in Mason's palm, its surface pitted with rust. He turned it over, examining the keyhole. The small key he'd found beneath the floorboard fit perfectly. A metallic click echoed through the silent kitchen as the lock sprang open. Mason hesitated. Walter's warning echoed in his mind. Some secrets aren't meant to stay buried. But he had to know. The door groaned as he pulled it open, revealing a yawning darkness beyond. A stale, damp smell wafted up, mildew, wet earth, and something sharper like old metal. The wooden stairs descended into blackness, their edges softened by years of decay. Mason tested the first step with his boot. It held. He took a deep breath and descended, the flashlight beam trembling slightly in his grip. The air grew colder with each step, the silence so thick he could hear his own heartbeat. At the bottom, the beam illuminated a sprawling basement, cluttered, but not with the hoarded chaos of the upstairs. This was organized, intentional. Metal shelves lined the walls, stacked with boxes labeled in Walter's cramped handwriting. Asterisk tax documents. 1987 to 1992. Property records. Asterisk against the far wall stood a large, old-fashioned safe, its dial gleaming faintly in the dim light. But it was the center of the room that made Mason freeze. A massive table dominated the space, its surface covered with maps. Some modern, some yellow with age, all marked with red circles and handwritten notes. Newspaper clippings were pinned haphazardly across them, their headlines screaming about missing persons, unsolved crimes, and government cover-ups. Strings connected some of the clippings, forming a spiderweb of conspiracy. Walter hadn't just been eccentric. He'd been investigating something. Mason stepped closer, his pulse quickening. One of the maps was of the town, with a single location circled repeatedly in thick red marker. Elmwood and Fifth, The old textile mill, abandoned for decades. A noise from upstairs shattered the silence. A thud, then footsteps. Mason's blood turned to ice. He hadn't imagined it this time. Someone was in the house. The footsteps moved quickly across the living room into the kitchen. Heavy, purposeful. Mason killed the flashlight, plunging the basement into darkness. Above him, the basement door creaked open. A beam of light swept across the stairs. Mason? The voice was familiar. Lena, his cousin, the one who'd laughed the loudest at the will reading. Mason held his breath. "I know you're down here," she called, her voice light, almost teasing. "Your car's out front." The flashlight beam danced closer. Mason's mind raced. Why was she here? How had she known where to find him? He crouched behind the table, his fingers brushing against something cold and smooth, a crowbar left leaning against the leg of the table. He gripped it tightly. Lena's footsteps reached the bottom of the stairs. "Come on, Mason. I just want to talk." He could see her now, silhouetted in the dim light from upstairs. She held her phone in one hand, its flashlight illuminating the basement in erratic bursts. Then her beam landed on the table. "On the maps." She went very still. "Oh my God," she whispered. Mason saw his chance. He stood, stepping out from behind the table. "Lena." She whirled, her eyes wide. For a moment, she just stared at him, then at the crowbar in his hand. Her expression shifted. Fear, then something harder. "What the hell is all this?" she demanded, gesturing at the table. Mason didn't lower the crowbar. "I was about to ask you the same thing. Why are you here?" Lena hesitated. Then, slowly, she reached into her pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "Because of this." She tossed it onto the table. Mason didn't move. "Open it," she said, keeping his eyes on her. He reached for the paper and unfolded it. It was a photocopy of a bank statement, Walter's account. The balance took Mason's breath away. $4,327,000. Dated 3 days before Walter's death. "Where did you get this?" Mason asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Lena's smile was thin. "The lawyer's office. I may have snooped after reading." She stepped closer. "Mason, think about it. Walter was broke, right? That's what everyone said. So where did $4 million come from?" Mason's gaze flicked to the safe. Lena followed his look. Her eyes lit up. "Oh my God. It's in there, isn't it?" She lunged for the safe. Mason grabbed her arm. "Wait." Lena yanked free, her face twisting. "Don't touch me. That money belongs to the family." "Walter left the house to me," Mason snapped. "Yeah, well, he wasn't in his right mind, was he?" Lena shot back. "Look at this place. He was crazy, Mason. And you're just going to take advantage of that." Mason's grip on the crowbar tightened. "Get out." For a long moment, they just stared at each other. Then Lena scoffed. "Fine, but this isn't over." She turned and stormed up the stairs, her footsteps heavy with fury. The front door slammed shut behind her. Silence fell. Mason exhaled shakily, his heart hammering. He looked down at the bank statement, still clutched in his hand. $4 million. And if Walter had withdrawn it before he died, his gaze drifted back to the safe. It had to be inside. He just had to open it. The safe and the secret. The safe loomed in the dim light, its steel surface cold under Mason's fingertips. He traced the dial, his mind racing. $4 million. It had to be inside. But how did Walter, a man who lived like a hermit in a decaying house, get that kind of money? And why hide it? Lena's words echoed in his head. That money belongs to the family. Mason clenched his jaw. No, Walter had left the house and everything in it to him. He needed to open the safe. The dial turned with a soft click, click, click. Mason had no idea what the combination could be. Walter's birthday? He tried it, August 23rd, 1950. Nothing. The year the house was built? 1924. Still nothing. Frustration gnawed at him. He stepped back, running a hand through his hair. His eyes fell on the table of maps and clippings. Walter had been obsessed with something big enough to cover an entire table. Maybe the combination was tied to that. He scanned the clippings. Most were about the old textile mill, Elmwood and Fifth, the location circled repeatedly on the map. A faded newspaper headline caught his eye. Local man claims mill holds government secrets. Authorities dismiss conspiracy theory. The article was dated in 1992. The local man was named, but Mason had no doubt it was Walter. He looked back at the safe. He spun the dial, 19-92. A heavy clunk echoed from inside the safe. Mason's breath caught. He pulled the handle. The door swung open. Inside, there were no stacks of cash. No gold bars. Just a single, thick manila envelope. Mason pulled out, his hands unsteady. The envelope was heavy, its contents shifting slightly as he turned it over. He tore it open. Dozens of bearer bonds spilled onto the table, each one crisp and official. He picked one up, his eyes widening at the number printed in bold. $50,000. There had to be at least 50 of them. $2.5 million. Beneath them lay a smaller stack of documents, legal papers, all stamped with official seals. Mason skimmed the first page, his stomach tightening. It was a deed for the textile mill. Walter hadn't just been researching the mill. He owned it. A noise upstairs made Mason freeze. A car door slammed outside. He stuffed the bonds and papers back into the envelope and shoved it into his jacket, his pulse roaring in his ears. He couldn't stay here, not with Lena knowing about the money. He bolted up the stairs, taking them two at a time. As he reached the kitchen, headlights flashed through the grimy windows. Someone was here. Mason ducked low, creeping to the front window. A sleek black SUV idled in the driveway behind his beat-up pickup. Two men in dark suits stood beside it, scanning the house. They weren't cops. They weren't family. And they looked official. Mason's grip on the envelope tightened. Walter's warning rang in his ears. Don't let them take what's yours. He slipped out the back door just as the front door burst open. The chase begins. The cold night air hit Mason's face like a slap as he stumbled through the overgrown backyard. His boots sank into the damp earth, each step threatening to betray him with a snapped twig or rustling leaves. The envelope pressed against his ribs beneath his jacket felt like it weighed 100 pounds. Somewhere behind him, a voice barked commands. Check the perimeter. He can't have gone far. Mason's breath came in ragged gasps as he reached the back fence. The wooden slats were rotten in places. Walter had never been one for home maintenance. He shoved his shoulder against a weak spot, wincing as it would splinter with crack that sounded like a gunshot in the quiet night. He squeezed through the gap just as a flashlight beam swept across the yard where he'd been standing seconds before. His heart hammered against his ribs as he pressed himself against the outside of the fence. The cold seeped through his jacket, mixing with the sweat, soaking his back. The voices grew closer. I heard something over here. Mason didn't wait to hear more. He pushed off from the fence and ran, keeping low as he cut through Mrs. Henderson's vegetable garden 2 houses down. The elderly woman's prize-winning tomatoes crushed underfoot, their ripe flesh bursting with each hurried step. He'd apologize later, if there was a later. The neighborhood was too exposed. He needed somewhere to think, somewhere to examine what he'd found. The bonds were one thing, but the deed to the mill... Walter had been hiding something much bigger than money. A car engine roared to life back at the house. They were spreading their search. Mason ducked behind a parked minivan as headlights swept down the street. His fingers trembled as he pulled out his phone, then hesitated. Who could he call? His family was clearly after the money. The police? Not until he knew who those men in suits worked for. The library. It would be closed at this hour, but Old Man Perkins, the night security guard, owed him a favor from when Mason had helped clean up after his grandson's vandalism spree last summer. More importantly, the library had computers and privacy. Mason kept the shadows as he moved, sticking to back alleys and cutting through yards. The town he'd lived in his whole life had never felt so foreign, every corner potentially hiding a new threat. His uncle's warnings took on new weight. Walter hadn't been paranoid. He'd been right to hide whatever this was. The library's back entrance was dark, except for the red glow of the security alarm panel. Mason pulled out his phone and dialed the number Perkins had scribbled on a napkin months ago. Perkins. The voice was gruff with sleep. It's Mason Reeves. I need a favor. A long pause, then the sound of a chair creaking. You in some kind of trouble, son? The kind that needs 5 minutes on computer and a place to lay low for an hour. Another pause, then the back door buzzed. You didn't get this from me. The library's basement archives smelled of dust and old paper. Perkins led him to a study corral in the far corner, away from windows. 1 hour, he muttered, handing Mason a key card. Computer Terminal 3 has the least filters. Don't make me regret this. Mason waited until Perkins's footsteps faded before pulling out the envelope. The bonds he set aside, they were straightforward enough. But the deed? He smoothed the aged paper on the desk. The mill had been purchased by Walter in 1989, just before the government shut it down, citing structural concerns. The same year, the first newspaper clippings in Walter's basement had been dated. Mason's fingers flew across the keyboard, pulling up newspaper archives. The first hit made his blood run cold. A grainy black and white photo showed a younger Walter being led from the mill in handcuffs, his face contorted in anger. The headline read, Local man arrested for trespassing at condemned property. But it was the date that caught Mason's attention, exactly 1 week after Walter's purchase of property. He'd been trying to get back into a building he already owned. Why? The answer came in the next article, buried in the business section 3 months later. Defense Department awards contract for secure storage facility. The location? The old textile mill. Mason's vision tunneled. Walter hadn't been crazy. He'd been robbed. The government had seized his property under false pretenses. And those bearer bonds, they weren't just money, they were payment. Hush money. A noise from the stairwell snapped Mason back to the present. The distinctive squeak of dress shoes on linoleum, not Perkins's worn sneakers. He quickly gathered the documents, stuffing them back into his jacket, just as the overhead lights flicked on. Well, Mr. Reeves. The voice was smooth, professional. I believe you have something that belongs to us. The truth in the documents. The fluorescent lights buzz overhead, casting harsh shadows across the library basement. Mason slowly turned to face the man standing at the bottom of the stairs, tall, clean-cut, with the kind of posture that screamed government agent. His suit was too sharp for this town, his expression unreadable. Mason's fingers twitched toward the envelope still hidden inside his jacket. Who the hell are you? The man didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached into his own coat and pulled out a badge, flashing it too quickly for Mason to catch the agency. Agent Daniel Shaw. We need to talk about your uncle. Mason's pulse pounded in his ears. They knew. They knew about the bonds, about the mill, about whatever Walter had been hiding. He forced himself to stay still. You just happened to find me here? Shaw's mouth quirked, not quite a smile. Your cousin Lena was very cooperative. Of course she was. Mason clenched his jaw. She'd sold him out the second she realized she couldn't get to the money herself. Shaw took a step forward, his voice dropping. This doesn't have to be difficult. Mason, hand over the documents, and we can forget this ever happened. Mason barked out a laugh. Yeah? And what's in those documents that's so important? Shaw's expression hardened. Classified information? Bullshit. Mason edged backward, his hand brushing against the edge of the desk. Walter owned that mill. You took it from him. Those bonds, their payment. A flicker of surprise crossed Shaw's face. Then, just as quickly, it was gone. Your uncle was a paranoid man, Mason. He saw conspiracies where there were none. Then why are you here? Mason shot back. Silence. Shaw exhaled sharply, as if deciding something. Because Walter wasn't just paranoid. He was right about one thing. That mill holds secrets. Dangerous ones. And now you have proof. Mason's mind raced. Walter's research, the maps, the clippings, it hadn't been madness. It had been evidence. Shaw reached into his jacket. Mason tensed, expecting a gun. Instead, the agent pulled out a photograph and slid it across the desk. The image was grainy, taken from a distance, but Mason recognized the mill's crumbling facade. What made his blood run cold, though, was a line of military trucks parked outside, men in hazmat suits loading crates into the building. The date stamp read, 3 days ago. Shaw's voice was quiet. This isn't about money, Mason. It's about what your uncle knew. And if you walk out of here with those documents, you'll be putting yourself and everyone you care about in danger. Mason stared at the photo. Walter had been onto something big. Something the government was still trying to cover up decades later. And now he was holding the proof. A noise from the stairwell made them both turn. Perkins stood there, pale-faced, his security radio crackling in his hand. "Mason," he rasped, "there's more of them outside. They're coming in." Shaw's posture shifted instantly. "You need to decide now, Mason. Come with me, or deal with the men who don't care if you walk out of here alive." Mason's grip tightened on the envelope. He had two choices: trust the agent, or run. The devil's bargain. The library's emergency exit alarm wailed as Mason crashed through the door, the cold night air biting at his lungs. Shaw's shouts faded behind him, swallowed by the blaring siren. Mason didn't look back. His boots pounded against the asphalt as he cut through the parking lot, the envelope of documents pressed tightly against his ribs. Every shadow seemed to move, every passing car a potential threat. He needed to disappear. The old train yard. Walter had taken him there as a kid, showing him the abandoned boxcars where hobbits sometimes camped. Best place to vanish. His uncle had said, tapping his temple knowingly. At the time, Mason had laughed it off as another of Walter's eccentricities. Now it might save his life. The chain-link fence rattled as Mason scaled it, the metal digging into his palms. He dropped down on the other side, landing in a crouch between two rusted freight cars. The scent of oil and damp would fill his nose as he caught his breath. He pulled out the envelope with shaking hands. The bonds were worthless now, too traceable. But the deed, the photograph, those were the real leverage. A crunch of gravel. Mason froze. "You're harder to catch than I expected." Shaw stepped into view, his suit jacket gone, sleeves rolled up to reveal a tattoo Mason recognized instantly. Military intelligence. The agent held up his empty hands. "I'm not here to fight. I'm here to make you an offer." Mason edged back. "What kind of offer?" "The kind that keeps you breathing." Shaw reached slowly into his pocket and tossed a burner phone at Mason's feet. "There's a number programmed in. Call it. Hear them out." Mason didn't move. "Who's them?" "The people your uncle was trying to expose." Shaw's expression turned grim. "They're willing to pay. A lot. More than those bonds are worth." Mason's stomach twisted. This was it. The moment Walter had warned him about. They wanted to buy his silence. "How do I know I can trust you?" "You don't." Shaw shrugged. "But you saw that photo. You know what's at stake now. Walk away rich, or keep digging and end up like Walter." The unspoken threat hung between them. Mason picked up the phone. The Mills Darkheart. The burner phone felt like a live grenade in Mason's pocket as he stood outside the abandoned textile mill. Dawn painted the sky in pale streaks, casting long shadows across the crumbling brick facade. Walter's words echoed in his mind. Some secrets aren't meant to stay buried. Shaw had given him 24 hours to decide. Take the money and disappear, or risk uncovering whatever nightmare lay hidden behind these boarded-up windows. The padlock on the service entrance broke with a single strike from a crowbar Mason had taken from Walter's basement. The door groaned open, revealing a darkness that smelled of damp concrete and something sharper. Chemical, medicinal. Mason's flashlight beam cut through the gloom, illuminating cavernous spaces where textile machines once hummed. Now, the vast floor was empty except for, his breath caught. At the far end, gleaming under layers of dust, stood a modern steel door with an electronic keypad. Government issue. Recent. The beam trembled in Mason's hand as he approached. The keypad lights glowed faintly, still powered after all these years. He reached for the envelope in his jacket, fingers brushing the deed. Walter had owned this place. There had to be. A slip of paper fluttered to the floor when he pulled the documents out. Walter's cramped handwriting. Code is her birthday. Her, Mason's mother, dead 15 years. Walter had never stopped grieving. With shaking fingers, he entered her birth date. The lock disengaged with a hydraulic hiss. Cold air rushed out as the door slid open, carrying a scent that made Mason's stomach lurch. Antiseptic and something organic, gone bad. The flashlight revealed a stainless steel corridor leading downward. Not a mill, a facility. The first room held files. Hundreds of them. Mason pulled one at random, his pulse hammering as he read the label, Project Nightshade. Subject 217. Inside were photographs of a man strapped to a medical table, his skin mottled with strange lesions. The dates placed at 3 years after the mill's supposed closure. A noise echoed from deeper in the facility. Metal scraping concrete. Something moving. Mason's blood turned to ice. He wasn't alone down here. Walter hadn't been tracking government secrets. He'd been documenting human experiments. And someone or something was still inside, the survivor in the dark. The sound came again, a wet, dragging shuffle from the corridor beyond the file room. Mason's flashlight beam wavered as he backed against the steel wall, his free hand gripping the crowbar so tightly his knuckles ached. Breathe. Just breathe. The chemical stench grew stronger, mixing with something organic and rotten. The beam caught movement at the edge of the hallway. A shadow that didn't match the pipes and conduits running along the ceiling. Something hunched. Humanoid, but wrong. Mason's throat tightened. He should run. Now. But Walter's voice seemed to whisper in his ear. They're still down here. He forced himself forward, step by step, until the beam illuminated the source of the noise. A man, or what was left of one. He crouched in the corner of a makeshift cell, his prison jumpsuit hanging off a skeletal frame. His hair was patchy, his skin a landscape of scars and healing lesions. But his eyes, when they locked onto Mason's, were painfully aware. "You're not one of them," the man rasped. His voice sounded raw, as if he hadn't spoken in years. Mason's pulse roared in his ears. "Who are you?" The man's cracked lips peeled back in something that wasn't quite a smile. Subject 219. Last survivor of Nightshade. He lifted a trembling hand, pointing past Mason. "Your uncle tried to free us." Mason turned. The beam illuminated a bulletin board covered in Walter's familiar scrawl, names, dates, and a single phrase repeated over and over. "Tell the world." The man coughed, a wet, rattling sound. "They injected us with something. Said it would make us better." A shudder ran through him. Most died within weeks. The rest changed. Mason's stomach twisted. "How long have you been down here?" A bitter laugh. "They shut the project down in 94. But they never left." His eyes darted toward the darkness beyond the cells. "You should go, before it wakes up." A new sound cut through the silence, then a deep, guttural growl from somewhere in facility's lower levels. Not human. Not anymore. The man's face went ashen. Too late. Metal screeched in the distance, something massive forcing its way through tight spaces. Mason made a decision. He smashed the crowbar against the cell lock until it broke. "Come on," he said, hauling the man to his feet. "We're getting out." But as they turned toward the exit, the steel door at the end of the corridor slid open with a hydraulic hiss. Silhouetted against the light stood 3 figures in hazmat suits, and they were holding rifles. The truth will out. The rifle barrels gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights as the hazmat-suited figures advanced. Mason shoved the weakened survivor behind him, raising the crowbar like a weapon. His mind raced. No exits, no cover, just the 3 of them trapped in this nightmare corridor. One of the figures reached up and detached their respirator. A woman's face, sharp-featured and cold. "Mason Reeves, you're even more stubborn than your uncle." Mason's grip tightened. "You knew Walter." "We dealt with Walter," she corrected. Her gloved finger rested lightly on the trigger. "Just like we'll deal with you, unless you hand over those documents." Behind him, Subject 219 let out a wheezing laugh. "They're lying. They always lie." The woman's gaze flicked to him, then back to Mason. "That man is a dangerous experiment. A failure. He doesn't understand what we're trying to accomplish here." Another growl echoed through the facility, closer this time. The lights flickered. Mason saw his chance. "You mean that?" He pointed past him just as a monstrous shape lurched into the light, a hulking mass of twisted flesh and exposed bone, its too many eyes reflecting the fluorescence like a cat's. The armed figure spun, firing. Mason grabbed 219's arm. "Run." They sprinted past the chaos, the creature's shrieks and gunfire ringing behind them. The survivor moved with surprising speed, his bony fingers digging into Mason's wrist. "Left!" There's an old freight elevator. They crashed through a maintenance door just as the creature's howls turned triumphant. A wet crunch, a scream cut short. The elevator cable screamed as they descended, the rusty platform shaking beneath them. 219 sagged against the wall, his breath coming in ragged gasps. They'll lock down the facility. Call reinforcements. Mason yanked the burner phone from his pocket. Not if the world sees us first. He opened the camera, turning to 219. "Tell me everything." As the elevator plunged into darkness, the survivor began to speak. Names, dates, the horrors of Project Nightshade. Mason recorded it all, his thumb hovering over the send button, on a draft email addressed to every major news outlet. The elevator hit bottom with a jarring thud. Moonlight streamed through the broken loading dock doors ahead. Freedom. 219 gripped Mason's shoulder. "They'll come for you." Mason met his gaze. "Let them." He pressed send. What would you do if you uncovered a government secret this dark? Let us know in the comments. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more gripping tales of ordinary people facing extraordinary choices.